The Origins of Proto-Semites. Where is the best place of the origins for Proto-Semites? We covered the many origins of Proto-Semites, mainly the Horn of Africa, Eastern Sahara, North Africa, and the Levant with the Natufians. The Semitic family is a member of the larger Afro-Asiatic family, all of whose other 5 or more branches have their origin in North Africa or the Maghreb. Largely for this reason, the ancestors of Proto-Semitic speakers were originally believed by some to have first arrived in the Middle East from North Africa, possibly as part of the operation of the Saharan pump around the late Neolithic. This was in red. In green, it says Dankoff sees Semitic originating between the Nile Delta and Canaan as the northernmost branch of Afro-Asiatic. In blue, it reads, Bench even wonders whether the highly divergent Greg languages indicate an origin in Ethiopia, with the rest of Ethiopic Semitic a later back migration. And in yellow it reads, according to Christy G. Turner II, there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason for a relationship between the modern Semitic-speaking populations of the Levant and the Natufian culture. So as you can see on the image to the left, or to the right, the various places where Afro-Asiatic and where Semitic could have originated from. And as we see from the readings that we just read, in red, there's a North African origin. In green, there is a now between the Nile Delta and Canaan origin. And in blue, a Ethiopian or Horn of Africa origin. And in yellow, a Levantine Natufian origin. But from an academic point of view, which one is the best? This is what we're going to find out today, using an Old Earth model. Remember what the Old Earth perspective is. Old Earth creationism, also known as OEC, is a form of creationism which includes day-age creationism, gap creationism, and progressive creationism. Broadly speaking, OEC, Old Earth creationism, occupies a middle ground between young Earth creationism, YEC, and theistic evolution, TE. Now, if you want to learn more about Old Earth creationism, I actually have a video that deals with Old Earth creationism and even young Earth creationism. But if you want a more deeper understanding of what it means, I have a playlist that deals with a very in-depth understanding of Old Earth creationism from various academics in the Abrahamic faith. But check these videos out for a more deeper, in-depth understanding. Again, this is in my playlist, Old Earth Creationism, as it is titled, and this will help you understand a little bit more about it. So we know that Semites are Afro-Asiatic people. We also know most Afro-Asiatics are haplogroup E. As we said before, Afro-Asiatic, of or relating to or being a family of languages widely distributed over southwestern Asia and Africa, including Semitic, and Semitic, of relating to or consisting a subfamily of the Afro-Asiatic language family that includes Hebrew. And of course, the Israelites, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way to Shem, they are a Semitic people. And we know, according to this journal from Human Journal of Human Genetics, this paper says the Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups including current speakers of the Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations. This was from Y chromosome E haplogroups, their distribution and implication to the origin of Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralism. Therefore, this study will focus on haplogroup E as the marker of Semitic people. Therefore, our goal is to establish why haplogroup E is Proto-Semitic. This is important because Y DNA haplogroups are passed down from father to son. The genealogy of Israel is also passed down from father to son, just like a haplogroup would. As we know in Genesis chapter 11, this is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. And then from Genesis chapter 11, 10 through 26, it reads, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serg, Nahor. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abraham. This is a complete genealogy of a male lineage going back to Abraham to Shem. And this fits exactly with a haplogroup. Paternal haplogroups. The paternal haplogroup relates to your Y chromosome, and since that is the sex determining chromosome for men, it is passed down from father to son. As women don't have a Y chromosome, they will not have a paternal haplogroup by default. However, they are able to find out what their paternal haplogroup is if a male relative from the father's side, ideally a brother, father, uncle, or grandfather, is also tested. But the main thing you need to keep in mind is this. The paternal haplogroup relates to your Y chromosome. And since that is the sex determining chromosome for men, it is passed down from father to son. Just like the genealogy, going from Shem all the way down to Abraham, from Abraham all the way down to Isaac, a perfect male line lineage. Furthermore, our goal is to figure out the best likely genotype of Proto-Semites, as well as the point of origin from whence they originated. And again, this is from an old Earth perspective. With all that being said, let's begin. The origins of haplogroup DE. D and E, which both descend from DE Yap, the first mutation that split into the E branch that perhaps returned to Africa. Down below is the source. Next source. Yap positive mutation occurred outside Africa, forming the DE clade, and this dispersed on to East Asia, becoming D, while the second DE branch returned to East Africa, there becoming E. The source is at the top. Next source. Haplogroup E is one of the two branches of the mega DE. It originated approximately 50,000 years ago. Scientists believe that it either rose in Africa or represents a back migration. The source for that is down below. And this is from 23andMe, and it says, it's possible that men carrying the DE haplogroup journeyed from Africa across the Red Sea and into the Arabian Peninsula, but it is also possible that haplogroup DE originated within the Arabian Peninsula itself and later spread back to Africa. This is a source. The source is down below. It says, regions near but external to northeast Africa, like the Levant or the southern Arabian Peninsula, could have served as the impetus for the early diversification of non-African unpaternal haplogroup varieties like Y chromosome DE YAP star. This model would imply that both CF-P143 and the DE-YAP evolved nearby but outside Africa. One DE-YAP star ancestor would have spread to Asia and evolved to haplogroup D, while another DE-YAP star returned to Northeast Africa and evolved into haplogroup E. Down below is the source. This one reads, but the fact that haplogroup E is closely linked with haplogroup D, which is not found in Africa, leaves open the possibility that E first arose in the Near or Middle East and was subsequently carried into Africa by a back migration. E1B1B1 probably evolved either in Northeast Africa or the Near East and then expanded to the west, both north and south of the Mediterranean Sea. The source is down below. So basically, all these sources are saying that haplogroup DE would have split in the Middle East. The likely location could be Mesopotamia. Here are more sources dealing with the haplogroup DE YAP originating in the Middle East. So it reads, consistent with previous proposals, a parsimonious interpretation of the phylogeny is that the prominent African haplogroup E arose outside the continent. This model of geographic segregation within the CT clade represents just one continental haplogroup exchange, E to Africa, rather than 3 D, C, and F out of Africa. Furthermore, the time of this putative return to Africa between the emergence of E and its differentiation within Africa by 58,000 years ago is consistent with proposals based on non-wide data of abundant gene flow between Africa and nearby regions of Asia 50 through 80,000 years ago. Here's a source: carriers of mitochondrial DNA, micro-haplogroup L3 basal lineages migrated back to Africa from Asia around 70,000 years ago. And it reads, the split of the Y chromosome composites DE haplogroup is very similar to the age of mitochondrial L3 and an Eurasian origin and back migration to Africa has been proposed for the African Y chromosome haplogroup E. This correlation rather seems to be the result of a joint and global replacement of the old autochthonous male and female African lineages by the new Eurasian incomers. Here's another source dealing with DE. It says, and this is from Use of Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA population structure in tracing human migrations, and it says, such an ancestral node would imply that DE is a subset of Eurasian variation, and therefore the African YAP chromosomes could be considered as due to a back migration from Asia. Here's another source dealing with it. Curiously, ancestral E star lineages have been detected in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. Here's another source: Saudi Arabian Y chromosome diversity and its relationship with nearby lineages. So it reads, Geographical distribution of these sub-Saharan African lineages in the Arabian Peninsula seem to indicate a prehistoric entrance of a noticeable portion of these lineages that participated in the building of the primitive Arabian population. The presence of two underived E-M96 Saudi lineages raises interesting questions related to the microhaplogroup DE-Yap phylogeography. Regions near but external to Northeast Africa, like the Levant or the southern Arabian Peninsula, could have served as an impetus for the early diversification of non-African unpaternal haplogroup varieties like Y chromosome DE-Yap star. This model would imply that both CF-P143 and the DE-Yap evolved nearby but outside Africa. One DE-Yap star ancestor would have spread to Asia and evolved into haplogroup D, while another DE-Yap star returned to Northeast Africa and evolved into haplogroup E. Here's another source dealing with haplogroup D and E called Yap insertion signature in South Asia. So it says, in contrast, Hammer at 1997 and 1998 paper, and Attilded and Hammer at 1997 hypothesized an alternative Asian origin. The lineage that acquired the Yap insertion polymorphism is divided into two subclusters: haplogroup E, found today in Africa and the Mediterranean, and haplogroup D, found in Japan and Southeast Asia. Underhill in 2001 paper. Y chromosome data on Indian populations reveal that the paternal lineage of present-day populations are predominantly derived from the original Indian gene pool, rather than a recent influx. Here is another study. Haplogroup D chromosomes have not been found anywhere outside of Asia, the likely place of origin of this haplogroup. D lineages are most commonly found in Central Asia, Tibet, and in Japan, and are also present at low frequencies in Southeast Asia and among Andaman Islanders. So here is a map dealing with haplogroup D, as they said. It is seen mostly in Tibet, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Haplogroup E is now defined by 18 mutations. There are a total of 83 polymorphic sites that mark lineages within this clade, compared with a total of 30 internal mutations in 2002. This makes haplogroup E by far the most mutational diverse of all major Y chromosome clades. These polymorphisms define 56 distinct haplogroups, which can be found at high frequencies in Africa, at moderate frequencies in the Middle East and Southern Europe, and with occasional occurrences in Central and South Asia. The origins of haplogroup DE, according to many geneticists, seems to have been in West Asia, also known as the Middle East. Although some say it could have emerged in Africa, there seems to be an overwhelming consensus that haplogroup DE is Middle Eastern or West Asian in origin. With that being said, who is the earliest descendants of haplogroup E? Basal Eurasians. Basal Eurasians. Basal Eurasians is an ethnic lineage which exists in greatest amount among ancient Near Eastern individuals. They had African-related tools in Arabia, hence they may have settled in the Levant or Arabia. The areas of the Near East where Basal Eurasians resided may have been areas where contact with Neanderthals, who were known to have lived in West Asia, West Eurasia, were not made. So here's a map of the Basal Eurasians, I can see right here. And so the genetic basin of this area around the Gulf is subplanetary basin and a potential source of Basal Eurasian origin. It has been suggested by recent genomic studies, including Almir at 2021 study and Fernander at 2021 study. As you can see, the Basal Eurasian homeland would have been right here in the Persian Gulf, as well as in Oman. So, possible location of the first human group bearing Basal Eurasian ancestry. For the new study by Fernand at 2021, the map shows the main human migration out of Africa, A00 out of Africa, which followed either a north route, the blue arrow, or a southern route, which is the red arrow. So here's a closer image of that. So the Basal Eurasian component that appeared in the Ibero-Maurusian and Natufian as a result of a relationship in the yellow zone. Perhaps the gene flow between the two continents was stronger in the north, represented by the two-way arrow, blue arrow, than in the south, as you can see right here. Here's a closer image. So now let's actually read and understand where the Basal Eurasians come from. The paper we're about to read is a recent one from 2021. It's called Projecting Ancient Ancestry in Modern-Day Arabians and Iranians, a Key Role of the Past Expose Arabo-Persian Gulf on Human Migrations. And so it reads, the highest levels of Basal Eurasian lineage found in East Arabio-Persian reinforced, AP by the way means Arabo-Persian, reinforce previous genetic and archaeological evidence of early human settlement in the exposed basin of the Arabo-Persian Gulf. Thus, the exposed basin of the Arabo-Persian Gulf is a possible homeland of Basal Eurasians. So here is another map showing where Basal Eurasians would have been, basically near the Persian Gulf in the Middle East. Basal Eurasians seem to have first appeared in the region of the Persian Gulf near Iraq, Iran, and Oman, but a group of them migrated to the Levant/North Africa. What would the Y DNA haplogroup of these Basal Eurasians be? Also, the ancient Ibero-Maurusians specimens could be in part descendants of Basal Eurasians, as they have a shared genetic affinity with early Paleocene Near Easterners, best proxy for the Natufians, and 1/3 of input from sub-Saharan Africans, a mixture between West and East Africans. Thus, so far, Southwestern Asia is still the most plausible homeland for the hypothetical Basal Eurasian population. So here is a map showing the Basal Eurasians, as you can see, ancient Middle Easterners, basically in the Middle East. And so this paper, Origins of Human Ancestry, it says, the origins of Basal Eurasian ancestry most likely centered around Southwest Asia and North Africa, and are unlikely to be connected to evidence of humans further away from Africa before 60,000 years ago. The scenario of a non-Neanderthal admixture, um, uh, the scenario of a non-Neanderthal admixed modern human population, which is basal to other Eurasians and resided in Africa, is plausible. In particular, North Africa is a strong candidate as a location for the emergence of Basal Eurasians, as it shares notable connection with Eurasia. Natufians, who share cryometric affinity with North Africans or Sub-Saharan Africans, and were of the Y chromosome haplogroup E, which likely originated in Africa, are of Basal Eurasian ancestry. Basal Eurasians had little to no Neanderthal admixture. The area of the Near East where Basal Eurasians resided was the Arabian Peninsula, from where haplogroup E spread to the Near East and North Africa. There was no contact with Neanderthals in the Arabian Peninsula, as it was outside the Neanderthal range, which explains why Near Easterners carry significantly less Neanderthal ancestry than Europeans. Haplogroup E is the Basal Eurasian haplogroup, based on its frequency in the Middle East at 10%, in Northern Europe at 1%. The Bedouin are the descendants of the earliest split from Basal Eurasian populations, with the highest frequency of haplogroup E-M123 at 24.3%. The Natufians, 50% Basal Eurasian, carried E-Z830, an ancestral clade of E-M123. A Saudi Arabian study found that Y chromosome DE-YAP star originated in the Arabian Peninsula, which served as an impetus for the early diversification of non-African haplogroups. This study, Genomic Insight into the Origin of Farming in the Near East, reads, cryometric analysis have suggested an affinity between the Natufians and populations of North or Sub-Saharan Africa as a result that finds some support from Y chromosome analysis, which shows that the Natufians and successor Levantine Neolithic populations carried haplogroup E of likely African origin, which has not been detected in other ancient males from West Eurasia. The Basal Eurasians that resided in the Levant and North Africa would have had haplogroup E. These Basal Eurasians would represent a back to Africa migration of haplogroup E, and therefore haplogroup E is Basal Eurasian in origin. And if this is the case, then what are the indigenous African haplogroups? A new study concluded that there was a massive migration of non-African Eurasians back into Africa about 70,000 years ago, spreading the Eurasian haplogroups, such as E and its parent DE within Africa, before additional waves of Eurasian admixture. Modern Africans, thus, are descendants of Paleo-Africans and Eurasians, or should I say Afro-Asians, or Afrosans, which merged in Africa between 70,000 years to 40,000 years ago. Here's the paper that actually deals with it, called Ancient Admixture in Africa from the Ancestors of Non-Africans. And here's a map showing Basal Eurasians or Ancestral West-Eurasians migrating into Africa, taking the haplogroup E marker into Africa. And so it reads, frequency of Y DNA haplogroup E in modern populations and hypothetical migration route from its ancestor clade DE in Southwest Asia, the Middle East. Haplogroup E arrived in Africa about 77,000 years ago and diversified in the Horn of Africa. It arrived together with specific West Eurasian alleles and later also diffused into various Paleo-African populations, as well as among ancient North Africans, also known as A and A, which were an population indigenous to North Africa and distinctly related or ancestral to modern Eurasians. Haplogroup E and DE have a Middle Eastern origin. Again, haplogroup E and DE have a Middle Eastern origin. Haplogroup E migrated into Africa as part of a mass migration of Basal Eurasians, Ancestral West-Eurasians, and then diffused and diversified within Africa, specifically the Horn of Africa, Northeast Africa. Haplogroup DE next to CF, where the Basal Eurasian lineage, which expanded from the Middle East. The common ancestral Y-DNA atom is suggested to have originated somewhere in the Middle East or the Iranian plateau. Massive Eurasian migration and following admixture created the many different African populations of today and are the reason for the high genetic diversity observed in sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, modern African people, sub-Saharan Africans, formed from indigenous Paleo-African groups and intrusive Afro-Sans, Basal Eurasians, and ancient North Africans. Finally, there is the fact why haplogroup E is dominant among non-hunter-gatherers in Africa, and it is within the Eurasian-clade DE, while indigenous African hunter-gatherers belong to haplogroup A00, and B. So from this paper, what we read is that Basal Eurasians are the haplogroup E individuals that migrated into Africa, and haplogroup E and DE originated in the Middle East, and that the indigenous Africans who are African hunter-gatherers are haplogroup A and B. Paleo-Africans will be haplogroup A and B. Basal Eurasians will have haplogroup E. We're ancient Middle Eastern populations. It's the simplest way to put it. And here is actually a paper that shows the various old markers of haplogroup A and B that we find in sub-Saharan Africa. Here's actually a closer image so you can see. Basically, it will be among, as I said, hunter-gatherer groups, pygmies and Khoisanes and people of that nature. Here's actually a paper that deals with haplogroup A and B and how it was all over Africa, deep paternal genetic roots in Africa from Scolzieri. A 2014 study shows that the old North African groups were A1A, A1B, A3B2, and possibly B1. You actually had a lot of haplogroup A and B all throughout Africa, even in North Africa. And the study to the right says ancient West African foragers in context of African population history. This paper actually shows that some of the oldest African haplogroups in West Africa are A and B markers. So even West Africa had a lot of A and B. And here's a map showing haplogroup A and its different frequencies in different parts of the continent of Africa. As you can see, A is still prevalent in Africa. It just depends on the population and the region. Same thing with haplogroup B. It is still present in Africa. It's not gone, and it is high in various parts and among various certain ethnic groups within Africa. That being said, again, haplogroup E invaded Africa, originally coming from the Near East. This is why haplogroup E is considered to be an Afro-Mediterranean haplogroup, whereas haplogroup A and B is considered to be Paleo-African, basically indigenous African or autochthonous. And as you can see on this map, haplogroup E came into Africa from North Africa and began to push haplogroup A and B people to the south into sub-Saharan Africa. And here is a literal a chart showing how haplogroup A and B are African, are like true African, whereas haplogroup E is more of an Afro-Mediterranean or Afro-Middle Eastern type of haplogroup. So Basal Eurasians, North Africa, or the Levant. If Basal Eurasians were in North Africa, then their descendants would become the Proto-Afro-Asiatics. This paper will literally prove this. It is The Origins of Afro-Asiatic by Christopher Ehret, S.O.Y. Kita, Paul Newman, Peter Bellwood, and other authors. So it reads, a careful reading of Dinkoff shows his continuing adherence to a long-held position of an exclusively African origin for the family. He explicitly describes Proto-Afro-Asiatic vocabulary as consistent with non-food producing vocabulary and links it to pre-Neolithic cultures in the Levant and in Africa, south of Egypt, noting the latter to be older. Dinkoff does revise his location for the common Semitic homeland, moving it from entirely within Northeast Africa to areas straddling the Nile Delta and Sinai, but continues to place the origins of the 5 other branches of Afro-Asiatic languages family wholly within Africa. One interpretation of the archaeological data supports a pre-food producing population movement from Africa into the Levant, consistent with the linguistic arguments for a pre-Neolithic migration of pre-Proto-Semitic speakers out of Africa via Sinai. If Basal Eurasians were in the Levant, then their descendants would become the Natufians. Afro-Asiatic is, and by the way, this paper is called Farmers and Their Languages, the First Expansion. This is from Jared Diamond and Peter Bellwood from Science Magazine, and it says Afro-Asiatic. This language family consists of 6 branches, 5 including ancient Egyptian, confined to North Africa, 1 Semitic, also extending in ancient times to Southwest Asia. That distribution suggests an African origin for the family, whose Semitic branch might then have spread into Southwest Asia. But the overwhelming archaeologically attested flow of domesticated crops and animals from Neolithic times onward into Egypt and throughout the Arabian Peninsula into Ethiopia is out of Southwest Asia rather than out of Africa. That would make it surprising for Semitic languages to have spread against that stream. There are 2 principal competing hypotheses for the origin of Afro-Asiatic. One based on reconstruction of early vocabulary for cultural and environmental fragments, places the homeland in the Levant during the earliest Neolithic, the late Neolithic culture, 9,500 BC. This, with a subsequent 2 prolonged spread by 5000 BC, that is well documented archaeologically. Mixed farming across the Nile into Egypt and North Africa, giving rise to the Egyptian and Berber branches of Afro-Asiatic languages, and sheep and goat-based pastoralism from Western Arabia across the Red Sea into Ethiopia and Sudan, giving rise to the Cushitic, Omotic, and Chadic branches. Semitic spread into Ethiopia much later. That Southwest Asian origin would now be masked by languages replacement in the homeland, including the spread of Semitic branch of Afro-Asiatic languages, including Akkadian or Babylonian, Aramaic, and Arabic in historic times. So whether Basal Eurasians and their descendants were in North Africa or the Levant, Proto-Afro-Asiatics would have emerged from these regions. And this is basically what I'm showing and proving, that the Basal Eurasians, when they went into either the Levant or North Africa. Either way, both locations would have brought forth Proto-Afro-Asiatics, North Africa and the Levant. Again, as I always read when it comes to this source dealing with Semitic languages, the Semitic family is a member of the larger Afro-Asiatic family, all of whose other 5 or more branches have their origin in North Africa or the Maghreb. And reading down below in yellow, according to Christy G. Turner II, there is an archaeological and physical anthropological reason for a relationship between the modern Semitic-speaking populations of the Levant and the Natufians. Again, North Africa and a Levant both work. The Proto-Semitic Genome. The Proto-Semitic Genome. Now we are going to discuss the best likely Proto-Semitic genome. What is the likely ancient DNA makeup of an early Semite? First, we will discuss the 2 best likely locations for the origins of Proto-Semites. So there is the North African origin of Semites. This book, by the way, is from E. Lipsky, Semitic Languages, Outline of a Comparative Grammar, and it reads, this implies that the speakers of Proto-Semitic were still dwelling in Africa in the 5th millennium BC in the Neolithic Plumule, which is from 5,500 through 3,500 BC, when the Sahara's climate was much wetter, so that erosion took place, as in other moist temperature and subtropical regions, and there was a proper system of rivers and vegetation consisting of grass with trees. A worsening of environmental conditions is indicated in North Africa, 3,500 BC, with disappearance of vegetation, a major funnel break of desertification and desertification. This might have been the period when the speakers of Proto-Semitic passed through the Nile Delta from the west to the east and reached Western Asia, where written documents of the 3rd millennium BC preserve noticeable traces of pre-Semitic, and in Mesopotamia also pre-Sumerian substring. This is from Peter Solomon Kozlowsk. He says, in this group, many of us conclude that haplogroup E is one of the major founding haplogroups of Semitic people, and that haplogroup E people were the ones who brought Proto-Semitic languages out of the Afro-Asiatic homeland in Northeast Africa into the Levant and Mesopotamia, just like that other source read. North Africa is one of the best primary candidates for the origins of Semites. Also, if this is the case, then Proto-Semites would likely have haplogroup E. This is the most logical way to go about things. So there's also the Levantine Natufian origin of Semites. This also is the second best. This paper makes, and by the way, this book is from the In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory by John D. Bingston. And so it says this paper makes an additional inference, since there is anthropological, archaeological, and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. And this paper deals with the DNA of the Natufians. Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus reveals core of West-Eurasian ancestry, and so it reads, such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. Natufians are one of the best primary candidates for the origins of Semites, and if this is the case, then Proto-Semites would likely have haplogroup E. So no matter where you put the origins of Proto-Semites, no matter where they emerged from, whether it's North Africa or the Levant, it would seem that they would still carry haplogroup E. Therefore, you can make a strong case for haplogroup E being Semitic, and many in academia do believe this. This is from a page called EUpedia. You can find this called haplogroup E1B1B Y-DNA, and so it says E-M34 is the main Middle Eastern variety of E1B1B and is thought to have arrived with the Proto-Semitic people in the late Copper to early Bronze Age. Keeping with the understanding that Proto-Semites emerged from North Africa, there seems to be a very strong case for this. The closest modern descendants to Basal Eurasians are Middle Easterners, Arabians, and Bedouins. The closest ancient descendants to Basal Eurasians are Ibero-Maurusians, who are a Basal Eurasian North African population. Therefore, all Middle Easterners and the earliest Semitic populations had ancient North African DNA. And so this is a paper from Projecting Ancient Ancestry and Modern Day Arabians and Iranians, a key role of the past exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf of human migration. So it reads, East Arabians also displayed the highest levels of the Basal Eurasian lineage of all tested modern-day populations. Not surprisingly, East Arabians are also the ones with higher similarity with Ibero-Maurusians, who are so far the best proxy for the Basal Eurasians amongst the known ancient specimens. Our results are strong evidence to include the exposed basin of the Arabo-Persian Gulf as plausible home of the Basal Eurasians to be investigated further, namely by researching ancient Arabian human specimens. So again, here's the map of where the Basal Eurasians are, and here's them trickling into North Africa. But it reads, also, ancient Ibero-Maurusians specimens could be in part descendants of Basal Eurasians, as they have a shared genetic affinity with early Heliocene Near Easterners. Best proxy are the Natufians, and 1/3 of input from Sub-Saharan Africans, a mixture between West and East Africans. Thus, so far, Southwestern Asia is still the best plausible homeland for the hypothetical Basal Eurasian population. Modern Saudi Arabia and Yemeni samples clustered tightly with a lower left quadrant overlapping with the three Natufian samples and were close to the Levant. PP and B, pre-pottery Neolithic B, and PP and C, pre-pottery Neolithic C, the Levant Bronze Age samples. A part of the modern UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Oman samples were more dispersed and mingled with North African Ibero-Maurusian and North African early Neolithic in accordance with some sub-Saharan input in their genomes. North African individuals, especially in Ibero-Maurusian samples, the same components were also found in parts of modern samples from the United Arab Emirates and Oman, together with a few individuals from Yemen. 2/3 of the West Arabo-Persian populations have ancestry shared with the Natufian, typical of the Levant, and the similarity with the Ibero-Maurusian was higher in the east rather than the west Arabo-Persians. The ancient Ibero-Mauritian sample included in the analysis was the one with the highest input of the Basal Eurasian lineage, even higher than the ones observed in modern East Arabo-Persian populations. Not surprisingly, cluster A bearing still a main no not surprisingly, cluster A bearing still a main 20% sub-Saharan African admixture was in a close position to the Ibero-Mauritian sample. The Ibero-Mauritian had a main signal in the Levant and West Arabo-Persian uh, condornated with a high Ibero-Mauritian Natufian similarity, followed by East Arabo-Persian, probably the Basal Eurasian similarity. Our results reveal that the eastern continuum was probably older given the stronger signal of the Basal Eurasian lineage and Ibero-Mauritians. In this side of the Arabo-Persian, definitely the Ibero-Mauritian specimens are the ones bearing a very high level of Basal Eurasian lineage, which could have been contributed by the sub-Saharan African input added by the Southwest Asian founder group, which moved to North Africa 20,000 years ago, bearing a high Basal Eurasian component. It is interesting that the current day Southwest Asian populations that show more genetic sharing with Ibero-Mauritians are the East Arabo-Persian populations. Now, confirmed a still high portion of the Basal Eurasian lineage / Ibero-Mauritian founding effect in cluster D, East Arabo-Persian and Iranian, and F West Arabo-Persian probably the Ibero-Mauritian specimens, and currently the best proxy for the Basal Eurasian population. The highest levels of Basal Eurasian lineage found in East Arabo-Persian reinforce previous genetic and archaeological evidence of early human settlement in the exposed basin of the Arabo-Persian Gulf. Thus, the exposed basin of the Arabo-Persian Gulf is a possible homeland of Basal Eurasians. And so here are charts that show the DNA of the Ibero-Mauritians and the modern populations who possess it. So as we can see, people in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the Arab Emirates have high levels of Ibero-Mauritian DNA, specifically in Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Here is Yemen and Saudi Arabia when it comes to Levant DNA, or PP&B. And so here's a map that will visually show you the areas that they're talking about. So as we can see in red, or in the A marker, this is dealing with the Ibero-Mauritians. And so as you can see right here in this light pink that I put in the red box, cluster A, and A will be over here. Basically the Persian Gulf and Oman, as they've been saying. These people have high amounts of Ibero-Mauritian DNA. And so here's another chart showing Ibero-Mauritian DNA, again in Oman and United Arab Emirates. And so, even the Natufians, the second best option for the origins of Semites, had this basal North African DNA. That's a very important thing to keep in mind. The Natufian this is actually a paper dealing with the breakdown of the Natufian DNA. Basically, the Natufian sample consisted of 61% Arabian, but 21% North African. Keep in mind, this is dealing with ancient North African because the Natufians are a Neolithic people. Also 10% Western Asian, 6% Omotic. But the key thing to keep in mind is that even the Natufians had this North African DNA. So, who are the Ibero-Maurusians? That's the first thing we need to know, because I mentioned these people a lot, but who are they? Like I said, they're basal North Africans, but what does this mean? So, the Ibero-Maurusian is a backed blade-slit lithic industry found near the coast of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. So that's sort of where they reside. It would have lasted until the early Heliocene, and this is when the North Africa was green. Los Ginrich, its 2018 study analyzed genome-wide data from 7 ancient individuals from the Ibero-Maurusian Grotte des Pigeons site near Tefort-Alt in northeastern Morocco. The scientists found that all males belong to haplogroup E1B1B, common among Afro-Asiatic males. The male specimens with sufficient nuclear DNA preservation belong to the paternal haplogroup E1B1B1A1, M78, with one skeleton bearing the E1B1B1A1 parent lineage to E-V13. One male specimen belonged to E1B1B M215. These Y-DNA clades 24,000 years ago had a common ancestor with the Berbers and the E1B1B1 M123 subhaplogroup that has been observed in skeletal remains belonging to the Epipaleolithic Natufian and pre-Pottery Neolithic cultures of the Levant. A two-way admixture scenario using Natufian and modern sub-Saharan samples, including West Africans and the Tanzanian Hadza, as reference populations inferred that the 7 Tayfolite individuals are best modeled genetically as of 63.5% Natufian related and 56.5% sub-Saharan ancestry, with the latter having both West African-like and Hadza-like ancestries. Y-DNA analysis shows that the Tayfolite males all belong to Y-DNA haplogroup E1B1B1A1 M78, which is closely related to E1B1B M213 subhaplogroup that has been observed in skeletal remains belonging to the Epipaleolithic Natufian and pre-Pottery Neolithic cultures of the Levant. Pleistocene North African genomes link Near Eastern and Sub-Saharan African human populations. We analyzed the genetic affinities of the Tayfolite individuals by performing principal component analysis (PCA) and model-based clustering of worldwide data. When projected onto the two PCs of African and West Eurasian populations, the Tayfolite individuals form a distinct cluster in an intermediate position between present-day North Africans and East Africans. Consistently, we find that all males of sufficient nuclear DNA preservation carries Y haplogroup E1B1A1 M78. The closest related E1B1B1B M123 haplogroup has been reported for Epipaleolithic Natufians and pre-Pottery Neolithic Levantines. Unsupervised genetic clustering also suggests a connection of Tayfolite to the Near East. The three major components that comprise the Tayfolite genomes are maximized in early Heliocene Levantines, East African hunter-gatherers Hadza from north-central Tanzania, and West Africans. We calculated outgroups statistics of the form across worldwide ancient and present day test populations. Consistent with previous analysis, we find that ancient Near Eastern populations, especially Epipaleolithic Natufians and early Neolithic Levantines, show the highest outgroup of values with Tefrault. When only the genetic variation of West-Eurasians is taken into account to construct PCs, we find that Tefrault individuals to fall outside the genetic variation of present-day West-Eurasians, consistent with the global and African PCAs. The Tefrault individuals form a tight cluster between Bedouins and East African nomadic groups. So as we could see from the study, the Basal-Eurasians had haplogroup E, and genetically they're close to the Natufians. Now, even when it comes to the latest origins of Semitic, linguists say there is an African origin and that ancestral Semites were between the African coast of the Red Sea and the Near East. This is from the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages, identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East. So it reads, the evolution of languages provides a unique opportunity to study human population history. The origin of Semitic and the nature of dispersals by Semitic-speaking populations are of great importance to our understanding of the ancient history of the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. Our statistical tests of alternative Semitic history support an additional divergence of Akkadian from ancestral Semitic over competing hypotheses and African origin of Semitic. We estimate an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic approximately 5,750 years ago in the Levant, and further suppose that contemporary Ethio-Semitic languages of Africa reflect a single introduction of early Ethio-Semitic from southern Arabia approximately 2,800 years ago. Our analysis of the Semitic language family produced a dated phylogeny that estimates the origin of Semitic at approximately 4,400 through 7,400 YBP. These results indicate that the ancestor of all Semitic languages in our dataset was being spoken in the Near East no earlier than approximately 7,400 YBP, after having diverged from Afro-Asiatic in Africa. The discovery of such early Semitic languages could increase estimates of the age of Semitic and alter its geographical origin if these early Semitic languages were found in Africa rather than the Middle East. The map of Semitic languages and inferred dispersals. So as you can see on the left, showing the map, and it says the map also presents the dispersal of Semitic languages inferred from our study, an origin of Afro-Asiatic along the African coast of the Red Sea, supported by comparative analysis, is indicated in red, although other African origins of Afro-Asiatic have been proposed, Southwest Ethiopia as an example. The assumed location of the divergence of ancestral Semitic from Afro-Asiatic between the African coast of the Red Sea and the Near East is indicated in italics. So as you can see right here, they have it in between Africa of the African side of the Red Sea and the Arabian side of the Red Sea. So it says our estimates for the origin of Semitic 4,400 through 7,400 YBP predates the first Akkadian inscription in the archaeological record of northern Mesopotamia by approximately 100 through 3,000 years. The city-states of Sumer were established and flourishing in Mesopotamia with their own indigenous languages unrelated to Semitic by approximately 5,400 YBP. So it is unlikely that Akkadian was spoken in Sumer for the entirety of the possible 3,000-year interval between the origin of Semitic and Akkadians' uh, in, intentional appearance in the archaeological record. The presence of ancient members of the two oldest Semitic groups, East and West Semitic, in the same region of the Levant, combined with the possible long interval of 100 through 3,000 years between the origin of Semitic and the appearance of Akkadian and Sumer, suggests a Semitic origin in the northeast Levant, and later movement of Akkadian eastward into Mesopotamia and Sumer. So, these ancestral Semites would have carried haplogroup E based on their movement from northeast Africa into the Levant and then later into Mesopotamia. It reads from this study, Genetics, Egypt, and History, Interpreting Geographical Patterns of Y Chromosome Variation. It says it can be postulated that select M35 carriers, speakers from Africa of a stage of ancestral Semitic, pre-Proto-Semitic, entered the Near East, kind of just like what we said earlier when it comes to the language. This book also covers it in hot pursuit of language in prehistory, and it says the overall pattern is consistent with a model of the first speakers of Afro-Asiatic having emerged in or near Horn of Africa or the Nile Valley. The presence of Semitic in the Near East might be explained as follows. Early pre-Proto-Semitic speakers would have migrated into Syrio-Palestine before the Neolithic, being taken by their M35 bearers, specifically M35 and M78. Furthermore, early Semites, they basically would have been African, as many people have said, such as a conversation with Christopher Ehret at a university. He says, after all, the early Semites were just a few Africans arriving to find a lot of other people already in the area. So you do have linguists that literally say that Semites are just they're an African group. Here's another book covering it, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. Greenberg determined that Semitic languages really form only one of 6 or more branches of a much larger language family, Afro-Asiatic. Even the Semitic subfamily itself is mainly African, 12 of its 19 surviving languages being confined to Ethiopia. This suggests that Afro-Asiatic languages arose in Africa and that only one branch of them spread to the Near East. Hence, it may have been Africa that gave birth to the languages spoken by the authors of the Old and New Testaments and the Quran, the moral pillars of Western civilization. Proto-Semites would have had haplogroup E and basal North African DNA. E-M34 is the main Middle Eastern variety of E1B1B and is thought to have arrived with Proto-Semitic people in the late Copper to early Bronze Age. We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. This paper dealing with Semitic languages and this study dealing with haplogroup E both align each other perfectly. Thus, from North Africa, wave after wave of Semitic migrations would have seemed to have set forth. The earliest of these migrants, and those who went furthest to the east, were the Akkadians, who journeyed along the Fertile Crescent through Palestine and Syria, and crossing over into Mesopotamia, reached northern Babylon circa 3000 BC, and founded the first Semitic empire at Kish. The southern Semites would have seemed to have reached the moisture highlands of Yemen and Hadramaut after 2000 BC, following the collapse of the early Bronze culture in Palestine, while the Ethiopians would have crossed over to the Horn of Africa when drier conditions prevailed in South Arabia, circa 15,000 through 500 BC. No matter where Proto-Semites emerged from, they would have basal North African DNA, Ibero-Mauritian, whether they come from North Africa or the Levant, because Natufians also had North African DNA. Doesn't matter where they come from, they still would have had this. Here's an image basically showing the Proto-Afro-Asiatic spread and origin, including the Proto-Semitic going into Northeast Africa into the Levant. The likely Proto-Semitic genome, whether the origins be North Africa or the Levant, basically they will have Y-DNA haplogroup E, basal North African DNA, and Neolithic Levantine/Natufian ancestry. This is what the genetic makeup would likely be. Proto-Semites and Haplogroup E. Proto-Semites and Haplogroup E. I believe it can be firmly established that Haplogroup E is a Semitic marker. Let's focus on the domination of Haplogroup E in the Levant, the very location for one of the origins of Semitic languages. This is from Ancient DNA from Chalcolithic Israel, reveals the role of population mixture in cultural transformation. And it says, this finding contrasts with both earlier Neolithic and Paleolithic Levantine populations, which were dominated by haplogroup E. So the Levant was dominated by haplogroup E markers. It will make sense that early Semites carried haplogroup E if the Semitic language originated from the Levant, and if Semites are descendants of the Neolithic Levantines, which only had haplogroup E. Furthermore, we see haplogroup E throughout the Levant even after the Neolithic era in known Semitic civilizations and people groups. So here is a map to the left showing the various haplogroup E markers we found in the ancient world, and to the right is the area of Natufian culture, basically the Levant. All of this is taking place in the Levant where you see these E markers. So here is a PPNB site. Remember, PPNB stands for Pre-Pottery Neolithic B. And we see E samples in the Jordan. Here is a area of northern Israel where we see various E markers. As a matter of fact, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 various E markers in the northern part of Israel. And then we have another E marker in North Israel during the Copper Age. And we have another sample of E. This is during the Middle Late Bronze Age at Hazor. MLBA stands for Middle Late Bronze Age. Megiddo, another Middle Late Bronze Age. We find 2 samples. And we find a DE sample in Tel Akkad in what looks to be Syria, but could be southern part of Anatolia, but I'll just say Syria. And we find another sample of E in Turkey or Anatolia. And we find E in Ebla. And this is very interesting because Ebla is a Semitic civilization, and this E marker we find is in that late Chalcolithic to early Bronze Age time frame. Ebla was one of the earliest kingdoms in Syria. I.J. Gilb considered Ebla as part of the Kish civilization, which was a cultural entity of East Semitic speaking populations that stretched from the center of Mesopotamia to the western Levant. Ebelite, or Paleo-Syrian, is an extinct Semitic language which was used during the 3rd millennium BCE by the populations of northern Syria. It was named after the ancient city of Ebla in modern western Syria. The East Semitic languages are one of the 3 divisions of the Semitic languages. The East Semitic group is attested by 3 distinct languages: Akkadian, Ebelite, and Kishite, all of which have been long extinct. So Ebelite is a Semitic language, East Semitic, and we find an E sample in its early civilization. We also find various E samples in various parts of Israel and the Levant kingdoms from the Iron Age period. This paper actually deals with the site of Alachain or Alachait. Forgive me for my pronunciation. But it says, the Middle and Late Bronze Age Near East, a period roughly spanning the 2nd millennium BC, 2000 through 12,000 BC, is frequently referred to as the First International Age, characterized by intense and far-reaching contacts between different entities from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Near East and beyond. In a large-scale tandem study of stable isotopes and ancient DNA of individuals excavated at Tel Anachait or Alachait, situated in the northern Levant, we explore the role of mobility at the capital of a regional kingdom. So here in this site, we find an E sample, and this site was thriving around the time of the 2nd millennium BC to the 12th millennium BC, as they said, and it is far to the north of the Levant, very close to famous places like Ebla and Ugarit. And so here are the samples we found here. We found 2 haplogroup E samples in this region from the study that I've read. So focusing on Proto-Semites, they would have expanded from the Levant into places like Mesopotamia. We actually can see a trail of this migration through DNA. E-M123 originated some 19,000 years ago during the last ice age. Its place of origin is uncertain, but it was probably in the Red Sea region, somewhere between the southern Levant and Ethiopia. Its main subclade, E-M34, most probably emerged in the Levant about 15,000 years ago. Soon afterwards, M34 split into 2 branches, M84 and Z841, which were probably found in the Fertile Crescent during the Neolithic period. E-M34 lineages experienced a much more dramatic expansion during the Chalcolithic Copper Age period. Also, downstream of CTS1096, the Y14891 and Z21018 clades are typically found among people of Jewish ancestry, while PF6391 and Z21421 are found in the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and the Arabian Peninsula. F1382 appears to have expanded during the Iron Age from the Levant to the Arabian Peninsula, where it is almost exclusively found today. So here is this migration of haplogroup E going into Mesopotamia. We have M34 going all the way into Mesopotamia. We see it in Mesopotamia at 4,600 years ago, which would have been around the late Copper to early Bronze Age. And we can also see when it comes to samples that we find, PPNA and PPNB samples going all the way into Mesopotamia. It fits perfectly. So I believe haplogroup E is the Y DNA haplogroup of Proto-Semitic people. This group would have expanded haplogroup E into Mesopotamia, which we see when it comes to the migration routes. And we see it specifically with the Eastern Semitic speakers such as Akkadians. E-M34 doesn't come close to predominating anywhere, but is most predominant in the southern Levant, Cyprus, Ethiopia, and the Jewish diaspora, with significant appearances in Kurdistan, the southern South Caucasus, Arabia, Iberia, Italy, Egypt, and the Maghreb. M34's direct ancestor E-Z830 was found this past year in Natufian samples from northern Israel, but IIRC E-M34's earliest attestation in the record is in a PPNB individual from An Ghazal in Jordan. A bit earlier, one of its major subclades, E-M34, was identified in Iron Age individuals from Armenia. A Levantine origin seems probable. A few years ago, it was pretty common to see people identifying E-M34, usually in combination with J-P58, as a marker of the Proto-Semites. But it's become obvious from the distribution that the truth is hairier. E-M34 has left a trail all areas of the Mediterranean, East Africa, and highland West Asia, where it's unlikely that Semitic languages were ever spoken. Naturally, this year, a DNA findings seems to confirm some link between early Semitic-speaking populations and E-M34. E-M34 is Epipaleolithic, which puts the divergence time of its major subclades E-L791 and E-M84 around the gladdochronology estimated dawn of Proto-Semitic in the Copper or early Bronze Age. So basically, haplogroup E would have been around the same time as the Proto-Semitic language, E-M34. And furthermore, as E-M34 was found in Bronze Age Armenian samples, it is possible that Semitic or Afro-Asiatic languages were spoken in Armenia or the Caucasus at this point. That's actually a very important point. So far, we have two E-M84 samples, Rise 416 and Rise 423, from Anarchan Gestain in Armenia, which date back to the Middle Bronze Age. Given the age of these samples, it's possible these individuals' paternal ancestors hailed from neighboring Mesopotamia and arrived in the region with Assyrian traders, who in turn were descendants of the Akkadians. This might hold true for at least one of the two samples. So what's interesting about haplogroup E is that we even find it as far north of the Near East as Armenia in the Middle Bronze Age, E-L700 and E-Y513. and some people believe that this could have been Akkadian expansions, is why we find these E markers so far north of the Near East. But this is very interesting. We find it even in Armenia. So E-M35 originating in the ancestral homeland of Afro-Asiatic and East Africa, and thus the homeland of Proto-Semitic. E-M35 is the major founding lineage of all Semitic people in this hypothesis. E-M34 was the founding lineage of East Semitic people as a first wave Neolithic Chalcolithic period out of Africa distribution to southern Arabia and Mesopotamia, either through North Africa and the Levant. And/or, as was often postulated before the 2016 Natufian ancient DNA findings across the Mandrib Strip, the 40-kilometer stretch of water between the tip of East Africa and Yemen. Thus, E-M34 would have been one of the founding lineages of the East Semitic Akkadian people and language. This first wave might be related to the Natufian settlement in the Levant, or more likely followed shortly after the success of their migration. E-M34 people in this hypothesis are descendant from the same ancestral people group as the Natufians, who lived in the East African Proto-Semitic tribal homeland before migrating to the Levant. Natufians, northern Israel, 10,000 years ago, Jordanians, Dead Sea, Ethiopian Amhara, Ethiopian Jews, Sahara, Mauritania, Algerian Kabils, Ethiopian Watua, Yemen, Ethiopian Oromo, Uzrum Turkish, Oman, and Bedouins. What is needed to verify or falsify the hypothesis of E-M34 as Akkadian is its distribution among Iraqi and Kurdish populations, and especially ancient DNA from skeletons found in scientific excavations of Akkadian sites in Mesopotamia. E-M78 was a major founding lineage of West Semitic people and northern Egyptian lower class slaves, workers, shepherds. E-M78 is an indicator of a second wave out of Africa of Proto-Semitic people during the early Bronze Age. Basically, a lot of E people would be coming out of Africa. These are Proto-Semites in the early Bronze Age. This most definitely was not just one haplogroup, but including many. Y-DNA E-M78 is a good migration indicator for this second wave. A significant majority of Jewish families with traditions of descent from King David are found in E-M78, a lineage that underwent a severe ancient extinction event in the conquest, exilic, and Roman periods. History indicates that there would likely have been very few survivors of this lineage, but a discussion that belongs to a different thread, though. So they talked about, Jewish people having haplogroup E, and we actually do find this in various different, I guess you could say, tribes. So the priestly Kohanim lineage from the tribe of Levi, they actually have haplogroup E markers. It says, however, the biggest and most important Samaritan family, the Kohen family, tradition, tribe of Levi, was found to belong to haplogroup E. This article predated the change of the classification of haplogroup E3b1-M78, which we just talked about, to E3b1-M78. In the further subdivision of E3b1-M78 into 6 subclades based on the research of Cronuni. And so here we see that Samaritans, the Levites, they for the most part have haplogroup E at 100%. I'm just going to mention some of these other Semitic groups with haplogroup E. The Arabs in Egypt have very high amounts of haplogroup E as well as Arabs in Palestine, Christian Palestinian Arabs have E at 31%. Arabs in the Jordan have E at 31%, and Arabs in Egypt have E at 62%. So E is most definitely found in the Semitic populations. As far as the discussion above, the Natufian ancient DNA tested into E-P2 and E-Z830 is the strongest link we have to the origins of East Semitic, as per my hypothesis above, and would then suggest E-P2, E-Z830, E-M123, and E-M34 are the founding Y DNA haplogroups of Akkadian and East Semitic. We've covered geneticists who say the exact same thing, that Semites would have haplogroup E and Akkadians would have haplogroup E, such as Peter Solomon Kowalski. It is possible that Northwest Semitic Hebrew people and languages dispersed into the Levant from Northeast Africa's now region around 5000 BCE. Thus, the earliest out-of-Africa settlement of Proto-Semitic people was likely in Yemen, on the southeastern region of the Arabian Peninsula. They then spread to the east and northeast to enter Mesopotamia and found the Semitic kingdom of Akkad and the Akkadian Empire. In this group, many of us conclude that haplogroup E is one of the major founding haplogroups of the Semitic people, and that haplogroup E people were the ones who brought Proto-Semitic language out of the Afro-Asiatic homeland in Northeast Africa into the Levant and Mesopotamia. So remember, the most recent paper on the origins of the Semitic language states this exact same thing, that Semites migrated in the Levant and that the ancient Semitic populations, such as Akkadians, expanded from the Levant into Mesopotamia. Reading in yellow, it says, we estimate that Semitic has had an early Bronze Age origin in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. Exact same thing. Let's place our focus deeper on the origins and expansion of Semites such as Akkadians. Where did they come from, and who are their ancestors? So here's a paper dealing with the origins of the Akkadians, early pastoral nomadicism, and the settlement of lower Mesopotamia. The Akkadians' nomadic origins have generally been assumed. Thus, the origins of pastoral nomadicism must be sought in the context of mixed farming within the Fertile Crescent, specifically during the PP&B, pre-Pottery Neolithic B. The Akkadians seem to have moved into the northern Arabian steppe and desert Jezreel and Hamad during the middle 7th millennium BC. The PP&B/C populations apparently began intensive herding at the end of the period and maintained ties to the Fertile Crescent, seen in both exotic trade and everyday culture. Archaeological sequences in the Arabian desert suggest that the Akkadians probably were a West Semitic Levantine background, So this book also covers the expansion of Semitic groups such as Akkadians and their origins. This book is called To the Euphrates and Beyond. And so it says, finally, many scholars have repeated and affirmed the old hypothesis that Semitic populations arose in periodic waves from the desert and inundated existing sedentary populations in the Mesopotamian alveolum. If we again turn our attention to the nature and distribution of PPNB sites in the desert, we can see that occupation spread in a north to south direction, and that the PPNB culture represented the apparent initial attempt at resettling the desert regions after the end of the Upper Paleolithic or Epipaleolithic. The PPNB cultural manifestation appears to and expand on the early Timonius steps toward mixed agriculture, perhaps began in the Natufian and PPNA periods. The PPNB culture was first identified and defined in the southern Levant at Jordan. So this right here, this book is even alluding to the Semites having a more Natufian and PPNB and PPNA origin. Ancient Semitic, people such as Akkadians descend from these PPNB people. But what is PPNB? First of all, we need to quickly refresh our memory on that. So this source will cover the PPNB. It is called the Genetic Linguistic Inference, and it says the 2005 book First Farmers, The Origins of Agricultural Societies by Peter Bellwood provides an excellent resource for linguists who wish to explore the worldwide correlation between the origins of agriculture and the expansion of languages. Prior to the adaptation of agriculture in Southwest Asia and elsewhere in the world, for that matter, the human tribe practiced hunter-gatherer techniques in order to survive. The evolution of agricultural in Southwest Asia generally follows a series of cultural transitions that begin with the Natufians, followed by the pre-Pottery Neolithic A and pre-Pottery Neolithic B, and then finally the development of pottery itself. The Natufians stand as an important cultural transition because they were the last hunter-gatherers in the Middle East. The Natufians appeared near the Sea of Galilee in what is now present-day Israel. So just like what that other source was saying. So PPNB, pre-Pottery Neolithic B, is a part of the pre-Pottery Neolithic. It was typed by Kathleen Kennan during her archaeological excavations at Jericho in the West Bank. Like the early PPNA people, the PPNB culture developed from the Mesolithic Natufian culture. Y DNA haplogroup E1, B1, B1, B2 has been found at 75% of the Angazelle population, along with 66% of the PPNB populations, and is present in all three stages of PPNB and in most Natufians. So the PPNB individuals, they had haplogroup E at 60%, and it's seen in all three pre-Pottery Neolithic time periods. And so here is the distribution of the area of Natufian culture, and here's the distribution of PPNB sites. And as we can see, they basically overlap because they're basically the same people. So again, we're brought back to the understanding that Proto-Semites would have expanded from the Levant, descending from PPNB Levantine populations, which would have been the Natufians that carried haplogroup E. Conclusion. The two of the best scenarios for the origins of Proto-Semites is either Northern Africa or the Levantine Natufians. No matter where Proto-Semites came from, they would still have basal North African Ibero-Maurusian DNA. If Semites came from Natufians, they would still carry this North African DNA because Natufians also had this North African DNA. Therefore, modern Semitic populations still carry this Ibero-Maurusian DNA. Therefore, I would say that basal North African DNA can be an indicator of Proto-Semitic ancestry. Also, haplogroup E from a paternal lineage found among ancient Levantine populations is the best candidate for the Y DNA of Proto-Semites, since Semites expanded from the Levant and descend from PP and B Levantine Natufian populations, and that they had only haplogroup E. Again, East Arabians also displayed the highest levels of the Basal Eurasian lineage of all tested modern populations. Not surprisingly, East Arabians were also the ones with higher similarity with Ibero-Maurusians, who were so far the best proxy for the Basal Eurasians among known ancient specimens. Our results are strong evidence to include the posited basin of Arabo-Persian Gulf as possible homeland of the Basal Eurasians to be investigated further on, namely by searching ancient Arabian human specimens. And the Natufians consisted of 61.2% Arabian and 21.2% Northern African. There goes your Northern African. And 10.9% Western Asian and 6.8% Omotic ancestry. And keep in mind that Northern African would likely be Ibero-Maurusian, ancient Northern African, because Natufians are ancient people themselves. And such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. Again, the two most likely origins for Semites, North Africa or the Levant. The Semitic family is a member of the larger Afroasiatic family, all of whose other 5 or more branches have their origin in North Africa or the Maghreb. Largely for this reason, the ancestors of Proto-Semitic speakers were originally believed by some to have first arrived in the Middle East from North Africa, possibly as part of the operation of the Saharan pump around the late Neolithic. That's the North African origin. Now for the Levant origin. According to Christy G. Turner II, there is an archaeological and physical anthropological reason for a relationship between the modern Semitic-speaking populations of the Levant and the Natufians. The Levant and North Africa are the two best origins for Proto-Semites. Remember, our goal is to figure out who are the ancient Israelites and their descendants today. Since the Israelites are an Afro-Asiatic Semitic people, we have to know the origins of Proto-Semites. Proto-Semitic populations would be the ancestors of the Israelites. And this is what we found out today. The two most best origins for the ancestors of the Israelites. North Africa or the Levant with the Natufians. As the genealogy goes, Israel are from Shem. They are Semitic. Their ancestors, Proto-Semites. And here is even the distribution of ancient Semitic and modern Semitic people. According to an old Earth perspective, the two best locations for the origins of Semites would be North Africa and Levant Natufians. Cannot stress this enough. With that being said, when it comes to the genome of Proto-Semites, the Israelites, and Israel's descendants, I expect to find a people with 1. Basal North African DNA. They should have some type of North African DNA. Since one, if they're coming from North Africa, then obviously they're going to have North African DNA. But 2, if they're coming from Natufians, Natufians themselves had ancient North African DNA. So we should see Basal North African DNA. And we even see it in modern Middle Easterners today. The second thing we should find is Neolithic Levantine/Natufian DNA. This is something that Semites should have. Modern people who claim to be from Israel should have. We see Neolithic Levantine DNA in modern Middle Easterners, and if the Proto-Semites, if they came from North Africa, they have to pass through the Levant where they would obtain Neolithic Levantine DNA. But if Semites originate from the Natufians themselves, then obviously they would have this Neolithic Levantine Natufian DNA. So look for Natufian DNA. That's one thing that we'll be looking for. And of course, Y chromosome haplogroup E. As we've seen many times over and over again, most linguists and geneticists do allude to the fact that haplogroup E is a Proto-Semitic marker. It is a Semitic marker of ancient or ancestral or old Semitic populations. We see it if Semites were coming out of North Africa, or if Semites were even coming from the Levant. E would have been present. So when it comes to finding out the genome, again, the genome of Proto-Semites, the Israelites, and Israel's descendants, look for Basal North African DNA, Neolithic Levantine/Natufian DNA, and Y chromosome haplogroup E. This is for the Semitic side. Proto-Semites. What did they look like? In order to answer this question, let's go back to the ancestors of Proto-Semites, the Basal Eurasians. We talked about the Basal Eurasians, an ancient Middle Eastern population that indigenous Middle Easterns are still related to. High levels of Basal Eurasian ancestry were found in ancient Middle Eastern genomes, which negatively correlated with Neanderthal ancestry. Basal Eurasians may have less Neanderthal ancestry than other ancestral Eurasian lineages, and the extent to which Basal Eurasian ancestry is present may explain the extent to which Neanderthal ancestry is present in Middle Eastern genomes. For example, a high level of Basal Eurasian or Sub-Saharan African ancestry could be the underlying reason for the low level of Neanderthal ancestry in Qatari Bedouin in comparison to Europeans or other Middle Eastern populations. Bedouin, who have the highest amount of autochthonous Arab genetic ancestry, may be the direct descendants of Basal Eurasians. So basically, Basal Eurasian ancestry is seen in ancient Middle Eastern genomes, and autochthonous Arab genetics is seen in the Bedouin people, and autochthonous being indigenous. So Basal Eurasians play a very important role when it comes to both ancient Middle Eastern genomes and indigenous Middle Easterners today. But what did the ancestors of indigenous Middle Eastern Semitic populations look like? Understanding the phenotype of these ancient populations can give us an idea of what the Israelites may have looked like and how the descendants of Israel could look if they remained homogeneous. So, What did Basal Eurasians look like? This paper deals with the phenotype when it comes to Basal Eurasians. From this published Nature paper, it points to Basal Eurasians resemble Africans or the Paleolithic Europeans. The study is called Levantine Cranium from Manto Cave in Israel foreshadows the first European human, modern humans. And so it says it is similar in shape to recent African skulls as well as to European skulls from the Upper Paleolithic period. And as you can see to the right of the screen, this is a Upper Paleolithic girl made by Tom Bajontud. And sorry if that was a mispronunciation, but this is how Upper Paleolithic people would have looked like. And they're saying that Basal Eurasians look like Paleolithic individuals. And so these are all representations of Paleolithic, ancient Paleolithic populations. Basically, they had brown skin, dark, seemingly possibly curly or wavy type of hair texture. So they looked like recent Africans from what we just read, and they looked like Upper Paleolithic Europeans. Upper Paleolithic Europeans basically had brown skin to black skin and black hair. Basal Eurasians looked no different than Africans and dark-skinned human populations. So Ibero-Maurusians is another ancient population that indigenous Middle Easterners descend from, and from North Africa is one of the best origins for Semites. As this paper says, East Arabians also displayed the highest level of the Basal Eurasian lineage of all tested modern human populations. Not surprisingly, East Arabians were also the ones with higher similarity with Ibero-Maurusians, who were so far the best proxy for the Basal Eurasians amongst the known ancient specimens. And remember, North Africa is one of the believed origins of Semites. This book covers it. This implies that the speakers of Proto-Semitic were still dwelling in Africa in the 5th millennium BC in the Neolithic subplume, when the Sahara's climate was much wetter, so that erosion took place as in other moist temperature or subtropical regions, and there was a proper system of rivers and vegetation consisting of grass with trees. So, what did Ibero-Maurusians look like? Since indigenous Middle Easterners would descend from or have Ibero-Maurusian ancestry, and Semites could have originated from the Neolithic North Africa. So the Saharan Ethiopid type is one good example. Ethiopid type that was more common during the Neolithic when the Sahara was still green, as we just read. Basically, reddish brown to black skin, tight curly hair, dolichoso-mesophalic skull structure. So this is one example what the ancestors of Middle Easterners could have looked like. And then here are Ibero-Maurusian reconstructions. And here is Ibero-Maurusian man and woman. The Kiefian culture is a prehistoric industry or domain that existed between approximately 8000 BC and 6000 BC in the Sahara Desert during the African humid period referred to as the Neolithic subplume, which we just read earlier about the Semites originating from. Craniometric analysis indicate that this early Paleocene population was closely related to the late Pleistocene Ibero-Maurusians, just like what indigenous Middle Easterners are related to. and early Heliocene Caspians of the Maghreb, as well as mid-Heliocene migrated groups. And so this is what the ancestors of Semites could have looked like and would have came from. This is a Keithian reconstruction, forensic reconstruction from the University of Chicago. And here are more reconstructions. Here's just a closer image, a little bit clearer. As you can see, they have dark brown skin, dark brown eyes, very dark brunette or black hair, and it seems to be wavy to curly. Based on the time period, location, and facial reconstructions, we can say 1. Saharan Ethiopia, 2. Red-brown to black skin, 3. Black woolly to curly hair, and 4. Dolichocephalic. Basically, Ibero-Eurasians would have looked African. So now, Natufians are said to be the ancestors of Semites. In this paper makes an additional inference since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. So what did Natufians look like? So here is the area of Natufian culture, basically in the Levant, from all the way from Sinai to Syria. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen is a reconstruction of a Natufian. So this is from the New York Times, Negroid people. By the way, the New York Times in 1857. It says a Negroid people of 5000 BC. And this actually comes from Keith, a well-known archaeologist. And he says they were clearly a Negroid people, said Sir Keith, with wide faces, flat noses, and long, large heads. They may have been the ancestors of the Arabs or Semites of biblical times, in Sir Keith's opinion. Several features stand out quite definitely. They were large-headed people, the pre-dynastic Egyptians. Secondly, are that they resemble pre-dynastic Egyptians. Thirdly, their faces were short and wide. Fourth, they were prognathous, which means that their jaw was projecting. Fifthly, their nasal bones were not narrow. Basically, they did not have a narrow nose and high. They were not narrow or high, but formed a wide, low arch. So they had wide noses. So putting everything together, these people had large heads. They had a prognathous jaw. It protruded out, and they had a wide nose. All of this basically fits the so-called Negroid phenotype, and he even said that they were Negroid. But just to fully show you what it looks like, they have a wide nasal opening and a prognathism and long skull length. That's the Negroid phenotype. They also make classified African American phenotype as well. But a Natufian skull pictured in Beckcontin 2003 exhibiting many features consistent with recent African ancestry. So as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is a Natufian skull, and he's basically saying that the skull it shows that there is like a type of recent African ancestry within the Natufians. And this is from Keith 1931. He says, has led me to the conclusion that all represent the same racial stock, talking about the Natufians. Remarkably was the nasal development of this cave people, most likely Negro-like in the flattening of the nasal bridge and in the width of the interorbital septum, such as might herald the pronounced nasal development of later Semitic races. And so basically, he's saying that the nose of the Natufians is very similar to a Negro, not like flattening of the nose, and that this nose structure may have later developed into the Semitic races that Natufians being the ancestors of. And so this also coming from Keith 1931 says, but with a distinct bias towards the African variety of that stock represented by the pre-dynastic people of Egypt, still observed by many Negro tribes in Africa. They remove one of or both upper central incisors in youth. And so basically he's saying he sees a lot of similar cultural traits with the Natufians and quote unquote Negro tribes of Africa. Descriptions of Natufian and PPN remains, by the way, PPN, pre-pottery Neolithic remains, consistently report post-pragmatic depression among other features consistent with sub-Saharan African ancestry. So again, they're saying that Natufian and pre-pottery Neolithic remains, they seem to have some type of sub-Saharan African ancestry and or features. And here is one of the most recent papers dealing with the phenotype of Natufians, the questionable contribution of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age to European craniofacial form. It is a further surprise that the Epio-Paleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to have arisen, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly enough, however, the small Natufian sample falls between the Niger-Congo group and the other samples used. This placement suggests that there may have been a sub-Saharan African element in the makeup of the Natufians. As shown in Figure 1, the Somalis and the Egyptian Bronze Age samples from Naquata may also give a hint of a sub-Saharan African component. So as we can see on this chart from Figure 3, it has Niger-Congo and Natufian linked, and then prehistoric/recent Northeast Africa is also linked, but further back. But Natufians seem to be very close to Niger-Congo phenotypically. And then we see on Figure 4 that Natufians basically fall in between the Niger-Congo and the prehistoric/recent Northeast African when it comes to cranial. So it says, in conclusion, if the late Pleistocene Natufian sample from Israel is the source from which that Neolithic spread was derived, then there was clearly a sub-Saharan African element present of almost equal importance in the late prehistoric Eurasian element. And I think common looks very similar to the Natufian reconstruction from the nose to the lips to the cheekbones, the forehead, everything, the eyes. I think common is like a good modern representation of what the Natufians could look like. So based on the time period, location, and facial reconstructions, they would have resembled Niger-Congo sub-Saharan Africans. They would have also resembled recent/ancient Northeast Africans. So basically, Natufians looked African. Putting all this information together, we see that the ancestors of Proto-Semites, beginning with Basal Eurasians to Ibero-Maurusians to Natufians, they all looked African, specifically more Sahelan. Therefore, the ancestors of Proto-Semites phenotypically were African in appearance. Here's putting all the information together from what a Basal Eurasian would look like, which would basically be a upper Paleolithic person, to what a Ibero-Maurusian would look like, which is basically a Saharan Ethiopid, and to what a Natufian would look like. This is just one image showing what the ancient ancestors of what Proto-Semites would look like. Now, this African phenotype for the ancestors of Semites makes sense. Early Semites were Africans, and early West Asians resembled Africans. This is something we have to keep in mind. Remember what Christopher Ehret said. After all, the early Semites were just a few Africans arriving to find a lot of other people already in the area. And this paper right here says that early West Asians resemble Africans. And that's from a comparison of craniofacial features of major human groups. With that being said, what did the Proto-Semites themselves look like? In order to answer this question, let's return back to what we know about Proto-Semites. Early Semites, like Akkadians, expanded from the Levant to Mesopotamia. We should look at the most ancient Semitic civilizations. So, what are they? We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. Linguistically, by the way, we're going to look at the book To the Euphrates that covers the migration and early civilizations of Semites, such as Akkadians and Eastern Semitic people. It says linguistically, Akkadian is recognized as belonging to the Semitic family of languages, and analysis of cuneiform texts suggests that people speaking Akkadian were well established in the Elevun by the early dynastic 2 through 3 periods. The center of political control in Akkad was often considered to be Kish, based on our interpretation of the Sumerian king list. Gleb has suggested that the civilization aspects of the period between 2700 BC and 2400 BC in Akkad should be labeled Kish civilization. The Akkadians can certainly be seen as the Matu predecessors in the 5th and 4th millennium BC, and perhaps Gleb's early Kish rulers, such as scorpion, fish, and dog, may represent the earliest stratum for the 6th millennium BC. Since we have PP and B, pre-pottery Neolithic B, populations in the western Iraq as early as the late 7th millennium BC, and the earliest Umbud settlements of Akkad and Kish do not antedate circa 5500 BC. It would be safe to conclude that Semitic nomadic pastoralists began to settle in the northern Avlun from the western desert and interact with other populations as early as the 7th millennium BC, and that early Semitic populations came from regions to the west of the Central Euphrates Valley and mountain Mephis, such as Jubel and Bereshit. One of the earliest Semitic settlements of the Akkadians was Umbud. So let's look at the Umbud remains to determine what early Semites could have looked like. Here is a paper that actually deals with the Umbud remains called Archaeology and the Sumerian Problem by Henry Frankfurt. And it says the people responsible for the Al-Umbud stage of culture belonged, to judge by their distribution, to the Middle Eastern section of the Mediterranean race, to the brown race of Christopher Elton Smith. In fact, but of their language we cannot say anything. As to the characteristics of the dolichocephalic population of Mesopotamia, Dr. Bringston distinguishes a brown Mediterranean and a brown Eurafrican type. They are, in fact, often included together in the term Mediterranean, but as distinguished by Dr. Buxton, the brown Mediterranean variety seems later and related with the West, whereas the Eurafrican type seems more ancient and has connections with the East. Brown Eurafrican variety of the dolichocephalic population at Kish and the other variety, the brown Mediterranean type, which is related with the West, can hardly have been anything but Semitic, for it is certain that we have to account the Mediterranean Semites from Arabia at an early date in Mesopotamia. So basically, they're saying that the brown Eurafrican or the brown Mediterranean type, it is Semitic. So what is the brown Eurafrican and brown Mediterranean? The Umbud remains were described, as such. So Sergi argued that the Mediterranean race had in fact originated in Africa, probably in the Sahara region, and that it also included a number of dark-skinned peoples from the African continent, such as Ethiopians and Somalis. Sergi also asserted that Semites were a branch of the Eurafricans who were closely related to the Mediterranean. So he even believes that Semites are a Eurafrican or Mediterranean, brown Eurafrican or brown Mediterranean people. So Gwipsby Sergi, a much debated book, The Mediterranean Race, 1901, argued that the Mediterranean race had likely originated from a common ancestral stock that evolved in the Sahara region, or the eastern part of Africa, in the region of the Great Lakes, near the source of the Nile, including Somaliland, and which later spread from there to populate North Africa and the circum-Mediterranean region. According to Sergi, Semites are a branch of brown Eurafricans Mediterranean race. Furthermore, the Mediterranean race originated in Africa. So this is interesting because he places the origin of the Eurafrican in the same location for the origins of Semites, North Africa or the Eastern Sahara. Remember, the Semitic family is a member of the larger Afro-Asiatic family, all of whose other 5 or more branches have their origin in North Africa or the Maghreb. Largely for this reason, the ancestors of Proto-Semitic speakers were originally believed by some to have first arrived in the Middle East from North Africa, possibly as part of the operation of the Saharan pump around the late Neolithic. Dinkoff sees Semitic originating between the Nile Delta and Canaan as the northmost branch of Afro-Asiatic. Bench even wonders whether the highly divergent Gregg languages indicate an origin in Ethiopia, with the rest of Ethiopic Semitic a later back migration. And this even matches the DNA. The overall pattern is consistent with a model of the first speakers of Afro-Asiatic having emerged in or near the Horn of Africa or the Nile Valley. The presence of Semitic in the Near East might be explained as follows. Early pre-Proto-Semitic speakers would have migrated into Syro-Palestine before the Neolithic, being taken by their M35 bearers, specifically M35/M78. Therefore, 2 phenotypes can fit the brown Eurafrican, the Saharan Ethiopid and the North Ethiopid. So the Saharan Ethiopid. Ethiopid type that was more common during the Neolithic when the Sahara was green, reddish brown to black skin, tightly curly hair, dolichocephalic mesocephalic, and the North Ethiopid, common along the Red Sea coast in the Nile Valley from Egypt to Eritrea and deep into the Ethiopian highlands. These are the exact regions that we're covering. often blend with Arabs and Yemenites that arrived in prehistoric times, sometimes in Arabia as well. Physical traits: dark, sometimes medium bronze brown skin, and tight curly hair. With that being said, what is another ancient civilization we can look into for the phenotype of ancient Semites? What is another ancient Semitic civilization we can use? So let's go back to this book. Linguistically, Akkadian is recognized as belonging to the Semitic family of languages. An analysis of cuneiform texts suggests that the people speaking Akkadian were well established in the Elavum by the early dynasty 2 through 3 periods. The center of political control in Akkad was often considered to be Kish, based on our interpretation of the Sumerian king list. Gleb has suggested that the civilizational aspects of the period between 2700 BC and 2400 BC in Akkad should be labeled as Kish civilization. So let's look at Kish. So Kish is in the lower part of the Euphrates and Tigris River, modern-day Iraq, and it was believed to be possibly the center of Akkad. So Kish of Sumer in Mesopotamia, founded during the Umbud period, which we just mentioned, Umbud, and Kish was occupied from the Umbud period, gaining prominence as one of the preeminent powers in the region during the early dynastic period, which is what we just read. The Kish civilization is a time period corresponding to the early, this is what we're looking for, early East Semitic era in Mesopotamia and the Levant. Coined by Iglis Gleb, the epoch began in the early 4th millennium BC. The tradition encompasses the sites of Ebla and Mari in the Levant. Very interesting. The Proto-Akkadian sites of Abu Sahalik and Kish in central Mesopotamia, which constitutes the Uri region, as it was known to the Sumerians. The East Akkadian population migrated from what is now in the Levant and spread into Mesopotamia, which is what we've been saying this whole time, that Eastern Semitic people migrated from the Levant into Mesopotamia. And so the Sumerian civilization of Kish showed an East Semitic nature and revealed that the city population had a strong Semitic component from the dawn of recorded history. This is very important. Gleb considered Kish to be the center of this civilization, hence the name. And so the East Semitic languages are one of the 3 divisions of the Semitic languages. The East Semitic group is attested by 3 distinct languages: Akkadian, Ebelite, and Kishite, all of which have long been extinct. Kishite language is the oldest known Semitic language. Very interesting. So here are the early Mesopotamian city-states, and there is Kish highlighted in red, and there is Akkad. So Kish is another ancient Semitic civilization in Mesopotamia. Let's study what these people looked like. What are their remains? So here is a paper that literally goes over the remains found at Kish. It's called Report on the Human Remains Found at Kish. This report on the human remains found at Kish by the Field Museum and Oxford Expedition is based on the material excavated in the Old Sumerian Palace at Eastern Kish. All remains from the palace, or in our terminology, Mound A, belong to the period immediately preceding the age of Sargon of Agad and are contemporary with the last 4th dynasty of Kish, circa 2900 through 2800 BC. The names of the 8 rulers of this period indicate early indicated clearly a Semitic dynasty. The population at Kish in the period to which the human remains of the palace belong should be therefore very mixed. Dr. Bingston finds 2 long-headed races in the palace skulls at Kish, which he designates as Euro-African and Mediterranean. So it's interesting when it comes to the Kish civilization, we know that it's clearly a Semitic dynasty, and when it comes through to the remains, we see that they're Euro-African and Mediterranean. Now let's continue. A considerable development of the temporal muscles and is found typically in such skulls as those of Australian Aboriginals. The capal skull are well known and will give a clear idea of the appearance of the Kish type A. The forehead was retreating and the brow ridge was always prominent. The cheekbones are rather broad and the nose also was broad, in some cases indicating extreme praetorium. There can be little doubt that this type is that which has been described by Sergei Fenderin Rigri and Fleury, named the Euro-African type. So basically, they're saying that these skulls resemble, Australian Aboriginals, but also they're saying that basically these skulls are a Euro-African type. They have very broad noses and very long skulls. And this is interesting because this is basically what we covered earlier when it came to the Natufians, that their noses were often very wide, and they also had a pronathonism when it came to their jaw, and that their skulls are very long, basically dolichocephalic. All this can fit the Negroid skull type just as much as the Australian skull type. And so, furthermore, the book continues to say, there can be little hesitation in describing this type to the people who have been called by Elliott Smith the brown race. These 2 types both belong to a group of humanity which is classed as a single race by Hilton, who well apparently associating the brown race includes a further group, the Semites, of whom only one group, the Bedouins, here concern us. In any case, up to the present among the bones from Kish, with 1 or 2 doubtful exceptions, I have not found any definite examples of the people whom Haldane describes as Semites, whereas there are certainly examples of the brown and the Euro-African races. On a morphological examination, it would appear that 2 branches of one common stock are to be found among the types represented by the skulls from Kish. So basically, they're saying that the Semites of Kish look like the brown Mediterranean and the brown Euro-African, but all still having a single stalk. So Elliott Smith describes the Kish remains as the brown race. So what is the brown race when it comes to his definition? So this is from General History of Africa, and it says, particularly, when we note once more that Mediterranean is not a synonym for white, Elliott Smith's brown or Mediterranean race being rather the mark. Elliott Smith classes these Proto-Egyptians as a branch of what he calls the brown race, which is the same as Sergei's Mediterranean or Euro-African race. The term brown in this context refers to skin color and is simply a euphemism for Negro. So, brown race, could be basically, the same as saying a Negro. So here is Elliot Smith from his own words, The Ancient Egyptians and the Origins of Civilization, where he covers the brown race. He says, the Mediterranean and East African latitudinals into the whole peninsula of Arabia and to the shores of the Persian Gulf. In other words, Syria, Arabia, Mesopotamia, and Sumer were parts of the original domain of the brown race, the Proto-Egyptians, but there can be no doubt whatever that their dark hair was associated with dark eyes and a bronze complexion. Wall paintings and statues with dark eyes and ruddy brown skin. Brown skin and iris of a black or dark brown color, as the living populations of Northeast Africa, which most nearly resemble the Proto-Egyptians in stature, have a copper brown skin color. We must look upon the old Egyptian custom of representing men of their nationality with red skin. So basically, according to Elliot Smith, Semites are part of the brown race. And this is interesting because he places the origins of the brown race in the same location for the origins of Semites in the Horn of Africa. But before I go into that, the description of the brown race that Elliot Smith is connecting to, basically he's saying that they would have been a reddish, dark brown people with black hair and brown eyes. But let's also go into where he puts the origins of these people. So he puts the origins of the brown race in the Horn of Africa. Now this is fairly interesting because we know that the Horn of Africa is actually one of the believed origins, should I say, for Semites. Dinkoff sees Semitic originating between the Nile Delta and Canaan as the northmost branch of Afro-Asiatic. Now Bench even wonders whether the high divergent Gregoric languages indicate an origin in Ethiopia, with the rest of Ethiopic Semitic a later back migration. And as you can see on the image to the right, Bench has an origin of Semites coming from the Horn, the exact same place where Elliot Smith has the origins of the brown race. So this is fairly interesting. And of course, when it comes to haplogroup E, this is one of the believed theories for where E could have came from. The overall pattern is consistent with a model of the first speakers of Afro-Asiatic having emerged in or near the Horn of Africa or the Nile Valley. Early pre-Proto-Semitic speakers would have migrated into Syro-Palestine before the Neolithic, being taken by their M35 bearers, specifically M35/M78. So, therefore, the phenotype that could fit the brown race is the East Ethiopid proper, showing the most prominent Ethiopic characters of all, common around the Horn of Africa in its purest form in the inland areas of Somalia and eastern Ethiopia. Dark reddish-brown skin, like what Elliot Smith said, curly to tightly curly hair, and dolichocephalic. So this is what, early, or should I say the ancestors, both the ancestors and Proto-Semites could look like, since we are dealing with the civilization of Kish and early Semitic people in Mesopotamia. So to conclude, Proto-Semites from ancient Semitic civilizations in Mesopotamia, such as Umbud and Kish, they could have been described, they're described as this: the brown Mediterranean, the brown Near-African, and the brown race. What does all this basically mean in summary? Let's just break this down. So, when it comes to the Mediterranean race by G. Sergi, he says, this human species with cranial and facial characters thus well determined, I call Eurafrican, and this because having had its origin in Africa. And this is the passing of the great race, and it says, the Mediterranean race was first described by Sergi, who also calls it Eurafrican. The Mediterranean race originated in Africa and is closely related to the Negro, both being long-skulled peoples descended from and a common stock, the Eurafrican. And this is from Contribution to the Anthropology of Iran, and it says Eurafrican, hair dark, rather dark skin, fluid complexion, moderately tall stature, average, very long dolichocephalic skull, cheekbones somewhat broad, often slightly prognathinous, again projecting near the jaw, nose often broad, dark eyes. With rather close curly hair, prognathinisms, and smaller measurements, this type with almost negroid characters may be called with the Gramandi type. Eurafrican, this is by Hayden, who we mentioned earlier. Skin, dark. Hair, dark. Eyes, dark. Head, very long. Nose, often broad. Prognathinism, often slight. Are they basically saying that Proto-Semites looked African? So is this what they're saying? Let's read from their own words. In a private conversation, he writes that this sequence is correct for Mesopotamia. As for an example at Kish, where the Mediterranean Proto-Semitic is under the Sumerian Alpine, he adds that the primitive Mediterranean type equals the Gallas, etc. of Somaliland and Kenya colony, which in turn equals Proto-Semites. So basically, Proto-Semites look like people from their remains, look like people from Gala, or the Gallas from Somaliland, and people in Kenya. And this is what Proto-Semites look like according to the remains. The best example could possibly be the Proto-Ethiopic type, ancient type that inhabited the southwestern Eritrean lowlands prior to the arrival of Ethiopians and possibly resemble early out-of-Africa types, was still common from Kenya to Sudan during historic times. Dark, sometimes medium brown skin and tight curly hair, dolichocephalic with robust, bony, and elongated features, prognathinism is relatively pronounced. This is kind of what I would say a Proto-Semite would look like from everything that we've just read. So, I would say yes, the phenotype, description, and location are all literally in Africa. Proto-Semites likely looked African, which is no different than how their ancestors would look, who would be the Basal Eurasians to the Ibero-Maurusians and the Natufians. Semites of Mari now when it comes to artwork, we actually know sort of what they look like, what ancient Semites would have looked like. And Syria is one of the best places when it comes to looking at their artwork and the way that they depicted themselves. So Mari was an ancient Semitic city-state in modern-day Syria. It flourished as a trade center and hegemonic state between 2900 BC and 1759 BC. As a purposely built city, the existence of Mari was related to its position in the middle of the Euphrates River routes. The Euphrates trade routes. This position made it an intermediary between Sumer in the south and the Ebelite kingdom in the Levant in the west. And so there is where Mari was, as you can see on the map. And below you can see what the people of Mari look like. And remember, these are Semites. Here's a closer image. Basically, dark brown skin, dark hair, and the eyes are likely dark as well. Here is another mural of people from Mari. Again, dark skin, dark brown skin, dark hair, and dark eyes. Here's another mural from Mari. Again, dark brown skin, dark eyes. And here is another mural from Mari, Syria. So the Semites of Mari, Syria are depicted with medium brown to dark brown skin, black hair, and dark eyes. This matches everything that we've covered thus far. Here's all the Mari depiction put together, so you can see everything on one image. So, from everything we've gathered so far, the ancestors of Proto-Semites, Basal Eurasians, Ibero-Maurusians, and Natufians, the Proto-Semites themselves, basically the remains found at Umbud and Kish, the way Semites depicted themselves in the murals of Mari, Syria. Proto-Semites would have looked African. Specifically, their phenotype would be dark skin, brown to black, hair color, black, hair texture, woolly to curly. Basal Eurasians, Ibero-Maurusians, Natufians, ancestors of Semites, and the Semites themselves, the Proto-Semites from Mari, Syria, an ancient Semitic civilization. And I have image to the left that kind of does fit with the exact same skin tone and hair texture and eye texture that we see. This is what Proto-Semites, early Semites, ancestors of Semites would have looked. So this is very important because it gives us an idea as to how the ancestors of Israel and the Israelites themselves and the descendants of Israel could look today if they remained homogeneous. From an old earth perspective, their phenotype could be African. After all, early Semites were Africans, and early West Asians resembled Africans. After all, the early Semites were just a few Africans arriving to find a lot of other people already in the area. Christopher Ehret. Early West Asians resembled Africans. Again, this was from comparison of craniofacial features of major human groups. And to the right of the screen, I even have what someone made their own interpretation of what Proto-Semites would have looked like. And it's probably not wrong. It's probably exactly what they sort of would look like. And again, the Israelites themselves are Semites. This is very important, knowing who they are ethnically as a people. They are descendants of Shem. So, this is where I conclude when it comes to the origins of Proto-Semites, specifically from an old earth perspective. And hopefully, y'all understood everything. Leave a comment if you have any questions. I'll be sure to answer them. And at the end of the full series, I will try to do my best to have a Q&A. But hopefully everything was understood.